You spent all day today at the White House, and the reason being they were unveiling the digital asset report, which was a part of the early Trump admin executive order to basically establish a regulatory framework for the entire digital asset ecosystem. I obviously want to hear all about it because I've not heard about it yet, but I also want to hear about the sort of tone in the room. I watched an interview from Eleanor Terra, Crypto in America. They interviewed Bo Hines, it seems like earlier this morning. And he basically made the comment that, look, this report was really intended to lay out the sort of playing field for digital assets more broadly. He said, we recognize Bitcoin. We're all big fans of Bitcoin. But that seemed to have sort of taken a sideline to some extent here. So I'm curious if that was kind of obvious in the room today, or if that was just kind of an offhanded comment.
Yeah. So first, just context, material, substance, and then atmospherics, right? So the context is this is a 180-day report that was due, 100 days after the executive order was signed. And I'll just note in terms of the timing, the requirement to write such a report and the original description of what the content of the report should be came before the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve executive order was separately issued. Right. So if you actually look back at the original language, it basically said this report should include essentially a whole section just dedicated to the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, including the scope of what assets should be held, yada, yada, yada. That executive order came out in like late January. The executive order establishing the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve came out in March and kind of like front ran like essentially what was ultimately, originally intended to be in this report. Right. Like if you go back to that original January, February, it was kind of like, oh, the SBR, they kind of kicked the can to this report. So we'll have to wait for this report to come out to learn, won't they do an SBR? And then they just decided to do it in early March, right? And so that kind of rendered the SBR component of this report, as it was originally conceived in January, kind of moot, right? Or it kind of reset the expectations then that, oh, you signed the executive order establishing SBR in March. This report will somehow be like a forward progression of that move, right? But just to kind of play from the perspective of the people drafting this, like the report was always supposed to be like at this level, right? And actually the kind of the SBR executive order kind of pulled forward the things that I think they had originally intended to put into this report. So that's like context. So that's why this is specifically really about their broader views of digital financial technology is what they call it, right? And it is a pretty comprehensive report. It's like 160 pages long, and it's divided up into a number of different subsections, giving a kind of a helpful introduction to like what Bitcoin is, what was the innovation, right? How does it work? Like they actually have pretty technical walkthroughs of like, here's how a blockchain works and here's the proof of work mechanism. So they actually do a pretty good job of like educating, like explaining the technology, explaining the innovation that Satoshi Nakamoto had. And I would note that, while Bitcoin is kind of like in the background, I would say, of this report, it like every single chapter is a quote from Satoshi or the Bitcoin talk forums, right? So I just find that to be quite revealing, indicative of like a meta point of like just how much like Bitcoin's culture is now kind of reflected in a White House report, digital assets. Like they're quoting Bitcoin talk forums, they're quoting Satoshi, they're linking back to like early debates in 2010, 2011, kind of OG discussions, right? And they're citing, Nakamoto Institute, posts, right? So it's a deeply informed report about the history of cryptocurrency in America and around the world as like a technology, right? So that's fundamentally how we think about it, as like an analytical report about the development of this new technology. But they're fundamentally like, they're not Bitcoin maximalists, right? By any means, right? They're surveying the development of technology to have a good chart that basically shows kind of the timeline of the different eras of Bitcoin and the emergence of digital assets, based off of Bitcoin, and then kind of the explosion of different protocols and booms and bust cycles, FTX collapse. They kind of give a history of that. There's like detailed policy recommendations though that I think are useful to dig into. There's like dozens of them in there, and I think we don't have time in this podcast to go through all of them, but they cover the waterfront from banking regulation, KYC, AML, tax. Basically it's a set of marching orders across the federal government to say we've done an inventory of like basically all the ill-fitting clothes around digital assets, that are in place. And we need to basically bring in a serious group of tailors to go around and sort of resize the sort of policy and regulatory, kind of clothing to fit to this new era, right? That's basically what this report is. It's sort of we've done the whole survey of all the different issues that we should fix. And it basically has a whole table of contents, recommendations to what can be done at the executive level, and who owns these different recommendations and who owns these different actions across CFTC, SEC, Treasury, IRS, DOJ, etc. And so I think overall, like a very, very, like, if you just zoom out, like this is like a night and day, right? When I first wrote the first white paper for BPI back in like 2021, my like ambitious call to action for the Biden administration was like, write like a Bitcoin strategy document, like just kind of like get yourself smart on this. And they wrote an executive order on digital assets that was kind of long, but it was like a bunch of studies. It was a bunch of reports. If you go back to the Biden administration, they were like, okay, we're going to issue this digital assets executive order, and we want to have like Treasury Department and a bunch of other departments like write reports, just a call for more reports. This is like very, very tactical, very specific, very in the weeds, right? It's a very in-depth report. On the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, I would note that like they leave it for the very end, right? But there's a full page kind of call out box just on it, and it doesn't do anything that I wasn't expecting to announce new purchases. It basically recapitulates what the executive order said in March, basically saying we will explore and will identify budget neutral means of acquiring additional Bitcoin. The one interesting little wink though is there's a footnote attached to that bullet that basically cites the sort of colloquialism in Bitcoin called stacking sats, right? And so here you have essentially footnotes referencing a kind of in-group colloquialism to refer to the U.S. government's acquisition plans for new Bitcoin. And then after the report has been released, I saw Bill Hines give an interview where he sort of went a bit further and said they are in the process of essentially operationalizing some of these ideas, right? And that they expect to pursue that, right? And Bitcoiners should be pleased. And I just think this takes time. Like my understanding is they spent like months just trying to find all the Bitcoin in America's different couch cushions, and it was a very messy administrative bureaucratic process. And just the process of setting up an office to manage the SBR is itself a complicated bureaucratic thing. Like who literally, like which physical person in which physical office inside the Treasury Department is going to have this responsibility, like what memos need to be written, which legal opinions need to be developed that like give it this authority, what sort of custody arrangements do they have? And governments move slow, right? And so I think they were expecting to have the full 180 days to kind of develop that office. And then the executive order came out in March, and then they were kind of on the clock. And, I think, again, Rome wasn't built in a day. I do not see this as a bearish report by any means. This is just the sequence of steps, right, that you need to go through before you go to the next one. So that was like high level context. Definitely worth digging in. You read it, you just sort of flip through it. You see a lot of work into this, and you see the call outs, especially like those quotes from Satoshi Nakamoto. I don't know, just like that. It hits different, right, than any government report I've ever read on digital assets. So like this is kind of a report written by people that kind of get the technology. They're not Bitcoin maximalists, but like in the scheme of things, they're not novices here, right? They understand here. And this is written, right, from the broadest perspective possible. It's written for the entire industry, right? And so that's like the substance, right? The atmospheric, so you had Bo Hines lead it off. David Sachs gave a speech. Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent gave a speech. The Attorney General Pam Bondi gave a speech. And, those are pretty heavy hitters, right? And they all basically sang from the same sheet of music. Again, it was like short and sweet, here are the talking points, nothing like, earth shattering, right? But it was a clear demonstration of the administration's priorities, right? To have essentially two cabinet officials take an hour out of their day to go and give potentially a talk on digital assets. So the upshot is, I think this is the next step, right? This isn't the end. This to them is like, all right, we spent 6 months just like cramming to basically do this massive sort of let's level set across the entire federal government. But now they have a whole bunch of very specific actions, like a whole bunch of, very tactical instructions, policy recommendations, and legislative objectives that they want to achieve. And so this is just like the next evolution now into now they have to execute this, they have to implement this. And so there's lots of opportunity now to get in the weeds, because I think a lot of folks across the administrative state, so to speak, right, in IRS, in Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, are sort of waiting on this report to be written. Because now that it's published, it's like, okay, these are the marching orders. Now it sort of waterfalls down the line. Now there's like very specific guidance that has to be rewritten or could be rewritten, inside Treasury, and it's like, all right, well, that's now going to go to that office. This is going to, I think, now sort of propagate through the government, and you'll see the government, I think, start to move a little bit more like tactically. We've had a lot of rhetoric, a lot of sort of strategic level kind of things happening at the White House. This is the sort of the type of activity that sort of starts to push that down into the government.
Fantastic. Zack, I want to go to you. Just any initial thoughts upon reading the report?
Yeah, I thought in general it's great. It's really thorough. It's going to take some time to sort of dig into all the details. I also appreciate it, even in the stablecoin section, there are a whole bunch of different Satoshi quotes. The part that's sort of nearest and dearest to my heart is the sort of very serious treatment that's given to how to appropriately address illicit finance risks while not putting burdens on developers and providers of non-custodial services. The report specifically recommends adoption of the protections for non-custodial developers and services from the Clarity Act and the BRCA. It calls both out by name and endorses them. There's a really good treatment of DeFi in general and sort of the challenges of applying illicit finance regs to DeFi, where protocols may or may not be under anyone's control. There may be some instances where you can have upgradability or different types of upgradability, and some decision-making is decentralized and some decision-making is centralized, and sort of the recognition that we do need sort of new laws that are written for the era we live in now, where peer-to-peer transfers of money, where peer-to-peer finance, where all sorts of peer-to-peer transactions can take place, that the sort of existing framework laid out by the Bank Secrecy Act and other laws that we have on the books really just isn't fit for purpose, sort of like moving from the era of 3 broadcast networks to an era where anyone can upload something to YouTube without having to host it themselves or get a broadcasting license, and you just need different rules for the new technology that arises. So I'm gratified to see that the report sort of takes that seriously and deals with it at length. Another really interesting section about sort of the need for insurance in the digital asset space, both sort of deposit insurance for things like stablecoins, sort of like D&O insurance for companies. It's really expensive for software development companies in the crypto space to get insurance that protects people like ordinary companies would have. It's really expensive and you don't get a lot of coverage. Everything's excluded. It calls out the need for a better coverage there, and things for, if you're going to insure sort of digital asset denominated risks, it recommends going to state regulators to have crypto become an admitted asset. So if you're insuring Bitcoin miners, for example, and the cost to your mining business being interrupted is denominated in Bitcoin because you're losing out on Bitcoin you would have mined, you need an insurance company to be able to hedge that risk with Bitcoin. So that's sort of an interesting deep cut that they put in there. I think the Treasury Department's been doing a good job talking to folks in the industry to figure out sort of details like that. There's a long tax section, which I haven't fully digested yet, but there are all sorts of interesting tax questions in the crypto space, which need to be addressed. And just tonally, the report takes sort of the culture and ethos of Bitcoin and digital asset space really seriously. Everything from the intro section, which really lays out a taxonomy between different types of digital assets and pretty clearly explains to someone who's willing to read a document this long sort of the breadth that this sort of industry and technology covers and what's different between these assets and where it came from. And then even things as little as the footnote in the SBR section that defines the term stacking sats. This was written by an administration that really at least had people in the government that wanted to take the time to understand these issues rather than sort of a sort of surface level treatment or hostility like we've seen in the past. And given what we do, right, the sort of education beat we've been on, this is awesome to see, right? This is a lot of progress from where we were, a couple of years ago or even a year ago. So overall, I think this is a really positive step. I think directionally, this is great and well thought through. And then the question is like, are we going to get the specific policy wins that the report points in the direction of?